Hello, profound aspirants. Welcome, courageous travelers. Welcome to the luminous heart of absolute surrealism, a space for those daring enough to explore the unseen layers of thought, emotion, and reality. In the deepest archives of medieval mysticism, buried beneath centuries of dense theological discourse and complex alchemical symbolism, there exists a concept so vital, so paradoxically simple, yet profoundly radical, that it threatens to collapse the entire fragile edifice of our modern understanding of psychic life. The concept is Viriditas, the greening power, the verdant force, the living emerald flame that silently courses through all creation. It was Hildegard von Bingen, the 12th century Benedictine abbess, visionary composer and polymath, who gave this force its most articulate, urgent expression, describing it as the fundamental divine vitality that animates not only the visible physical world, but the vast, turbulent interior landscape of the human soul. To speak of Viriditas is to speak of something the contemporary, rational mind has systematically forgotten how to perceive. We live in a devastating age of psychological drought, where the soul has been systematically desiccated by suffocating rationalism, by consuming materialism, and by the relentless, reductive demands of instrumental thinking. The modern individual moves through existence in a state of chronic, spiritual dehydration, tragically mistaking the desert for reality itself. Yet beneath this arid, brittle surface, there persists an ancient memory, a collective recollection, a profound intuition of what it means to be truly, vibrantly alive. Not merely in the biological sense, but in the psycho-spiritual dimension, the sacred space where authentic meaning is born. Hildegard understood Viriditas as more than a poetic metaphor. For her, it represented the divine moisture, the life-giving sap that flows from the Godhead into all creation, maintaining all things in their proper state of flourishing and becoming. When Viriditas is actively present, the soul is supple, responsive, generative. It is a wellspring. When it withdraws, when it is blocked, the result is what Hildegard termed ariditas, dryness, sterility, the terrible death in life that characterizes all spiritual and psychological crisis. This radical dichotomy between verdancy and aridity maps directly onto the ancient alchemical distinction between the living and the dead, the quickened and the inert. The urgent question that confronts us now is not whether Viriditas exists, but whether we, the inheritors of this desiccated age, possess the organs of perception necessary to recognize it. The alchemists understood that certain truths cannot be grasped by the discursive intellect alone. They require what Jung would later call the symbolic attitude, a mode of consciousness that perceives the numinous living patterns underlying all manifest reality. To approach Viriditas is to undertake a kind of seeing that our culture has systematically trained us to dismiss as primitive, irrational, or merely subjective. Yet, it is precisely this ancient seeing that offers the only possibility of restoration in an age of unprecedented psychic fragmentation. The doctrine of Viriditas rests upon a foundational premise that directly contradicts the prevailing metaphysics of modernity. The cosmos is not a dead, random mechanism, but a living totality, and the human being participates in this cosmic life through channels both visible and invisible. This is not pantheism in the naive sense, nor is it mere animism. It is something far more sophisticated, a core recognition that consciousness and matter exist on a dynamic continuum, that what we call life is not an accidental property of certain molecular arrangements, but an ontological principle woven into the fundamental fabric of existence itself. Hildegard's theological framework provides the scaffolding for understanding the source of Viriditas, but the concept transcends any single religious tradition. In her visions, she perceived the universe as a vast organism suffused with divine presence, what she called the living light. Within this visionary cosmology, humanity occupies a unique, pivotal position, not as master or exploiter, but as microcosm, a concentrated, living reflection of the macrocosmic whole. The human being contains within themselves the entire spectrum of creation, from the mineral depths to the celestial heights, when Viriditas flows freely through this microcosmic structure, the individual experiences what Hildegard termed integrus, wholeness, integrity, the profound state of being properly aligned with one's essential divine nature. The crisis we face is the loss of integrus and the subsequent domination of ariditas. The soul's vital green fire has been choked off. The alchemical tradition, developing parallel to and often profoundly intertwined with Christian mysticism, articulated similar principles through its elaborate, dense symbolic language. The prima materia, the base, common substance from which the legendary philosopher's stone is eventually extracted, must first be quickened, brought to life, through the precise application of heat, moisture, and the mysterious catalytic agent the alchemists called the secret fire. This crucial quickening, this necessary infusion of life, is nothing other than the infusion of Viriditas into dead, inert matter. The alchemist, contrary to popular myth, does not truly create life, but rather meticulously removes the psychological and material obstacles that prevent life, the inherent vitality, from manifesting. The entire alchemical opus, the great work, can be understood as a sustained, ritualistic meditation on the exact conditions under which dormant vitality finally awakens. Jung's analytical psychology provides a crucial, indispensable hermeneutic key for unlocking the profound psychological significance of these medieval and early modern texts. Jung recognized that the alchemists were not simply deluded protochemists seeking physical gold, but were engaged in a deep exploration of the objective psyche, what he termed the collective unconscious. The alchemical symbols, including the greening of the work, the appearance of the peacock's tail, cauda pavonis, and the final emergence of the golden stone, lapis, represent essential stages in the individuation process, the lifelong journey towards psychic wholeness. In Jungian terms, Viriditas corresponds directly to the autonomous, generative activity of the self, the central archetype of wholeness that orchestrates the necessary integration of conscious and unconscious contents. When an individual is structurally cut off from the self, trapped and isolated in ego consciousness, and completely identified with the defensive persona, the result is precisely the ariditas Hildegard described. The ego, operating in isolation, has no inherent, inexhaustible source of renewal. It exhausts itself completely through constant frantic striving, never touching the deep, living springs of psychic life. Only when consciousness becomes permeable, receptive to the unconscious, when the ego begins to consciously recognize itself as subordinate to a greater wholeness, does the greening, the renewal, finally begin. The transformation process is not passive. Viriditas does not simply descend upon the deserving soul like passive grace from above, though grace may indeed be a contributing factor. Rather, it requires what the alchemists called the opus contra naturalem, work against nature, or more precisely, work against the pervasive entropy of psychological inertia. The soul must be tilled, irrigated, exposed to the right psychological conditions. This is where the alchemical image of the vas hermeticum, the sealed vessel, becomes psychologically crucial. The soul must be contained, protected from the dissipation, the draining noise and demands of collective life in order for the sensitive transformation to occur. In psychological terms, this means establishing a temenos, a sacred precinct, a protective container within the psyche, within which the essential inner work can proceed undisturbed. The greening is therefore both gift and necessary task, both passive receptivity and conscious activity. It arrives autonomously from beyond the ego, yet it requires the ego's deliberate cooperation. This paradox is central to understanding the relationship between grace and effort in true spiritual development. The mistake of volunteerism is to believe we can force transformation through sheer dominating effort alone. The mistake of quietism is to wait passively for transformation to arrive, without preparing the ground, the middle path, which both Hildegard and the alchemists intuited. is one of attentive receptivity, preparing the ground meticulously, maintaining the exact conditions, and then allowing what wants to emerge to do so in its own organic time. The recovery of Viriditas follows a discernible pattern, a sequence of psychological states that recur across cultures and individuals. This is not because humans are trapped in some mechanistic repetition, but because the psyche itself possesses an inherent universal structure, an archetypal scaffolding that shapes the trajectory of transformation. To chart this journey is to map the universal features of what Jung called the individuation process, the movement from fragmentation toward wholeness, from unconsciousness toward consciousness, from identification with the ego toward a profound, lasting relationship with the self. The first unavoidable stage, the nigredo, the blackening, the recognition of the profound inner drought. Every single authentic transformation begins in darkness. Before the soul can be restored to verdancy, it must first confront the full, devastating extent of its desolation. This is the stage the alchemists termed nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the descent into the underworld of the psyche. In terms of Viriditas, this is the critical moment, when ariditas, the spiritual dryness, can no longer be denied or rationalized away. The individual wakes viscerally to the terrifying reality that they have been living a death in life, that the structures of meaning that once sustained them have become brittle and lifeless. This recognition is not merely intellectual, but profound and visceral. It often arrives violently, as crushing depression, as paralyzing anxiety, or as a pervasive, inescapable sense of futility that Jung termed the loss of soul. The modern person, trained meticulously to view such states as mere neurochemical imbalances to be corrected instantly with pharmacology or quick cognitive reprogramming, resists the essential truth that the nigredo is urgently trying to communicate. Something fundamental is wrong, not just with your brain chemistry, but with your core relationship to your own psychic depths. Hildegard would have instantly recognized this state as the withdrawal of divine moisture, the drying of the soul that occurs when one lives in perpetual violation of one's essential nature. The causes are manifold: identification with the rigid persona, betrayal of one's true calling, systematic repression of instinctual life, or simply the heavy accumulated weight of years lived inauthentically. Whatever the specific cause, if the nigredo was tragically characterized by dissent and dissolution and the crushing darkness of despair, the albedo marks the crucial first tentative emergence of something utterly new. The alchemists depicted this stage as the appearance of the white stone, lapis albus, the morning star, the first fragile light after the longest, darkest night of the soul. In psychological terms, this is the moment when consciousness, having voluntarily descended into the unconscious, begins to actively differentiate the complex contents it encounters there. The albedo is often experienced not as a sudden explosion of joy, but as a subtle, pervasive shift in perception, a gradual, quiet awareness that the existential despair of the nigredo is not the whole, final truth. Dreams become noticeably more vivid. Synchronicities multiply with strange precision. Unexpected, clarifying insights arrive without effort. The soul, having been scoured clean by suffering, by the furnace of the blackening, becomes receptive in a way it was never capable of being before. This is the absolute beginning of Viriditas, not yet the full, triumphant flowering, but the first, barely perceptible greening, like tenacious shoots emerging from soil that seemed utterly barren. Jung emphasized that the albedo involves a crucial psychological operation, the necessary separation of opposites that had previously been unconsciously fused. The individual begins to consciously distinguish between the restrictive persona and the vital shadow, between the fearful ego and the guiding self, between what is truly theirs and what has been introjected, swallowed whole and undigested from the collective external world. This intense differentiation is painful but fundamentally necessary. It is the tilling of the soil, the breaking up of the hardened crust that prevents new life from emerging. Hildegard's imagery is deeply instructive here. She spoke of the divine moisture, not as a devastating, overwhelming flood, but as a gentle, measured rain, a controlled infusion of grace that respects the inherent fragility of the recovering soul. Too much, too fast, and the individual is completely overwhelmed, swept away by the power of the numinous. The albedo is a time of convalescence, of gradual, careful strengthening, of learning to hold consciousness in the presence of the unconscious, without identification or without psychological inflation. This is the patient cultivation of the inner psychic garden. The third stage, Viriditas, the yellowing, the solar dawn, is recognized by some alchemical traditions as a distinct, necessary phase in the work. This is the moment when the first tentative stirrings of the albedo consolidate into something much more stable, when the individual begins to integrate the profound insights gained from their terrifying descent. In terms of Viriditas, this is when the greening becomes absolutely undeniable. The soul is no longer merely surviving, but actively beginning to flourish. Creative energies return in abundance. Relationships deepen with authenticity. A profound, stable sense of purpose emerges. The individual discovers within themselves capacities they did not consciously know they possessed. Not because these capacities are new, but because the stifling ariditas, the old dryness, had completely concealed them. Yet the Viriditas carries its own profound dangers. As vitality returns, so does the temptation to premature closure, to declare the work finished before it truly is. The ego, strengthened dramatically by the influx of psychic energy, may attempt to violently reassert its dominance, to co-opt the transformation entirely for its own limited, self-serving purposes. This is spiritual inflation, the arrogant belief that one has achieved a permanent state of enlightenment or total integration. The alchemists were acutely aware of this danger, which is why they insisted on the necessity of the final stage, the rubedo. The yellowing is not the culmination. It is merely the prelude. The soul has been restored to life, but it has not yet achieved the fullness of its potential. For that, one more complete death and one more final rebirth is absolutely required. The rubedo, the regreening, the emergence of the red stone, or the incorruptible gold, represents the final culminating stage of the entire alchemical work. This is the moment when spirit and matter, consciousness and unconsciousness, achieve their final dynamic synthesis. In psychological terms, this is the ultimate integration of the self, the point at which the ego accepts its proper, necessary relationship to the totality of the psyche. This stage is characterized by what Jung called the transcendent function, the profound capacity to consciously hold opposites in creative tension without violently repressing either pole. The individual no longer swings wildly between unbearable extremes, but dwells securely in the creative center, the point where all opposites are reconciled without being dissolved into meaningless neutrality. This is not a static achievement. It is not a final fixed state, but a dynamic equilibrium, a continual necessary dance between conscious and unconscious, ego and self. In terms of Viriditas, the rubedo is the state of perpetual greening, the sacred condition in which the soul maintains its vitality, not through frantic external stimulus, but through its constant open connection to the inexhaustible source within. The individual becomes, in Hildegard's luminous language, a garden enclosed, a sacred, protected space where the divine moisture flows continually, nourishing all aspects of life without obstruction. But the rubedo is also profoundly characterized by an essential, learned humility. Having traveled the entire, terrifying circuit of transformation, the individual recognizes that the self they have become is not their own personal achievement, but a gift, a constant, daily participation in something that vastly exceeds their personal boundaries. The greening is not owned, but stewarded, not possessed, but faithfully transmitted. The recovery of integrus, the wholeness, brings with it the responsibility of becoming a channel for the life-giving force, for Viriditas itself. The paradox of this final stage is critical. The integration is never complete, never final. The work of maintaining Viriditas is lifelong. The soul can always dry up again if one returns to old arid patterns, if consciousness once more becomes identified exclusively with the ego, if the connection to the unconscious is severed, the ariditas will return. This is why the alchemist spoke of the opus circulatorium, the circular work, the eternal return to the beginning of the process. Each cycle of death and rebirth deepens the capacity for wholeness, but there is no point at which one can proudly declare, "I have arrived, the work is finished." The Jungian path of individuation is similarly understood, not as a destination, but as a direction, not as a singular achievement, but as an ongoing, conscious orientation. The self is never fully realized in consciousness. It always retains its numinous, transpersonal character. The ego learns to live in relationship to this perpetual mystery, without trying to capture or possess it. This is the meaning of true psychological maturity, not the perfection of consciousness, but the acceptance of its essential incompleteness. The individual who emerges from the crucible of transformation is not the person who entered. This is not metaphorical language, but literal, observable truth. The entire structure of consciousness has been reorganized around a new, deeper center. Where once the ego imagined itself sovereign, now it understands itself as servant to the self. Where once it sought to control and possess, now it learns to receive and steward the green fire. This is not a diminishment, it is an expansion, a gain of incalculable, vital proportions. The restored Viriditas manifests in concrete, observable ways. There is a renewed capacity for joy, not the manic excitement of the ego, but the deeper gladness that arises from authentic alignment with one's essential nature. Creativity flows more freely, not as forced production, but as spontaneous, unburdened expression. Relationships deepen because the individual is no longer relating from the fortress of persona, but from the authentic core of the self, and perhaps most significant is the development of spiritual autonomy. The individual no longer requires external validation or approval to know themselves real. They have encountered the ground of their own being and found it sufficient. This means freedom from the compulsive need for others' recognition, freedom to give and receive from a place of abundance, rather than scarcity, to speak of Viriditas, without immediately addressing its opposite. The cold, hard truth of ariditas is to indulge in mere spiritual fantasy. The harsh reality is this: most people, most of the time, do not dwell in the verdant, nourished garden, but in the vast, desiccated wasteland of ariditas. This is not a moral failing, but a structural, existential condition, the baseline state of consciousness in an age that has systematically severed its connection to the symbolic and to the numinous. The profound crisis of the soul in modernity is fundamentally a crisis of meaning. When the traditional containers of meaning, religion, myth, ritual, community, collapse or become mere empty shells, the individual is violently thrown back upon themselves with only the impoverished, limited resources of ego consciousness to make sense of existence. The result is what Viktor Frankl called the existential vacuum, a pervasive, soul-consuming sense of futility and purposelessness that no amount of external achievement can ever truly fill. This vacuum manifests in myriad visible ways: the global epidemic of depression and anxiety, the proliferation of addictions, the desperate, frantic search for identity in consumer culture or rigid ideological tribalism, the collective flight into virtual reality or pharmaceutical oblivion. All of these are symptoms of the same underlying condition: the loss of Viriditas, the drying of the soul's deepest springs. Jung recognized that this crisis could not be resolved through mere adjustment to social norms or through the simple elimination of surface symptoms. The person who is depressed because their life lacks meaning cannot be cured by becoming better adapted to a fundamentally meaningless existence. What is urgently required is not adjustment, but transformation. Not simple healing, but profound initiation. The crisis is not the problem you must fight. It is the necessary doorway, the prelude to a deeper, more authentic engagement with reality. Hildegard's theology offers a framework for understanding precisely why the withdrawal of Viriditas occurs. In her cosmology, the soul dries up when it turns away from its source, when it becomes fixated only on the created rather than the creator, when it tragically mistakes the finite for the infinite. This is not divine punishment, but natural consequence. Cut off from the deep, living wellspring, the soul inevitably withers. From a Jungian perspective, ariditas results from the ego's aggressive refusal to acknowledge its subordination to the self. When consciousness becomes identified exclusively with the ego and its narrow, fearful concerns, when it dismisses the unconscious as mere irrationality or pathology, the vital connection to the deeper sources of psychic life is severed. The individual becomes, in Jung's phrase, one-sided, overdeveloped in certain functions, atrophied in others, incapable of the wholeness that is their birthright. The encounter with deep despair is therefore not an unfortunate accident, but a necessary station on the path. It is the soul's way of signaling that something is fundamentally wrong, that the current mode of existence is tragically unsustainable. To medicate away the despair, to distract oneself from it constantly, to explain it away through reductionist theories, is to refuse the urgent call to transformation. The despair must be entered, endured, and ultimately allowed to do its work of dismantling the false structures that prevent authentic life from emerging. This is the central paradox. At the heart of the nigredo and the subsequent ariditas, the darkest night of the soul is also the moment of greatest potential, the complete exhaustion, the utter failure of the ego's limited resources creates the crucial opening through which the self can finally be encountered. But this demands a terrifying willingness to relinquish control, to admit that one does not and cannot know the way forward, to surrender to a process that unfolds according to its own logic rather than the ego's plans. The alchemists understood this, which is why they insisted that the work requires both labor and grace. One must prepare the vessel, maintain the heat, attend to the process diligently, but the actual transformation is not something the operator performs. It is something that happens, that emerges autonomously from the material itself. When the conditions are absolutely right, in psychological terms, this means creating the essential space for the unconscious to man. If est, for the self to reveal itself, for Viriditas to flow once more through the newly receptive soul. The psychological result is tragically the same, a vast landscape of inner drought, where nothing grows and nothing can grow. The temptation at this stage is overwhelming. Flight into distraction, into addiction, into superficial spiritual bypassing, or the manic, desperate pursuit of external solutions to fundamentally internal problems. But the alchemical tradition is absolute and unequivocal. There is no way around the nigredo, only through it. The darkness must be entered, not as punishment, but as necessary preparation. Only in consciously accepting the reality of the drought does the psychological possibility of rain emerge. This stage demands what Jung called the encounter with the shadow, the conscious realization of one's own darkness and incompleteness. The failure to integrate the shadow is the primary source of the modern ariditas. The despair must be entered, endured, and ultimately allowed to do its work of dismantling the false, brittle structures that prevent authentic life from emerging. This is the paradox at the heart of the nigredo. The darkest night of the soul is also the moment of greatest potential. The complete, utter exhaustion of the ego's resources creates the crucial opening through which the self can finally be encountered. But this requires a terrifying willingness to relinquish control, to admit that one does not and cannot know the way forward, to surrender to a process that unfolds according to its own logic, rather than the ego's limited plans. The alchemists understood this, which is why they insisted that the work requires both labor and grace. One must prepare the vessel, maintain the heat, attend to the process, but the actual transformation is not something the operator performs. It is something that happens, that emerges autonomously from the material itself, when the conditions are right. In psychological terms, this means creating the necessary space for the unconscious to manifest, for the self to reveal itself, for Viriditas to flow once more. Through the newly opened, desiccated channels of the soul, the individual who finally emerges from the crucible of transformation is not structurally the person who entered. This is not metaphorical language, but literal, observable truth. The entire structure of consciousness has been reorganized around a new, unshakable center, where once the ego frantically imagined itself sovereign, now it understands itself as servant to the greater self, where once it sought to control and possess, now it learns to receive and steward the green fire. This is not a psychological diminishment. It is a profound expansion, a gain of incalculable, vital proportions. The restored Viriditas manifests in concrete, observable, undeniable ways. There is a renewed capacity for deep, quiet joy, not the manic excitement of the ego, but the deeper gladness that arises from authentic alignment with one's essential nature. Creativity flows more freely, not as forced production, but as spontaneous, unburdened expression. Relationships deepen because the individual is no longer relating from the rigid fortress of persona, but from the authentic core of the self. Jung described the integrated individual as one who has achieved the union of opposites, conscious and unconscious, masculine and feminine, spiritual and instinctual. Such a person dwells in what he called the psychological middle, the sacred point where extremes are held in creati, the dynamic tension. This is not lukewarm compromise, but active, dynamic synthesis, the ability to access the full spectrum of human possibility without being captured by any single pole. Hildegard's language captures something similar when she speaks of the soul in a state of integrous, wholeness, soundness, the condition of being properly integrated within oneself and profoundly connected with the cosmos. Such a soul, she suggests, becomes a channel for divine creativity, a means through which the greening power flows into the world. The individual is no longer merely a recipient of Viriditas, but an active agent of its transmission. But perhaps most significant is the development of spiritual autonomy. The individual no longer requires external validation or approval to know themselves real. They have encountered the ground of their own being and found it sufficient. This means freedom from the compulsive need for others' recognition, freedom to give and receive from a place of abundance rather than scarcity. Yet the integration is never complete. The work of maintaining Viriditas is lifelong. The soul can always dry up again if one returns to old, arid patterns. This is why the alchemists spoke of the opus circulatorium, the circular work, the eternal return to the beginning. The Jungian path of individuation is similarly understood, not as a destination, but as an ongoing orientation. The self is never fully realized in consciousness. It always retains its numinous, transpersonal character. The ego learns to live in relationship to this perpetual mystery without trying to capture or possess it. This is the meaning of psychological maturity. In the final analysis, the doctrine of Viriditas delivers us to a recognition, both humbling and exalting. The greening you see. K cannot be manufactured, cannot be purchased, cannot be seized by force of will, but it can be received by those who have learned to prepare the ground, who have dared the descent into their own darkness, who have consented to the slow work of transformation that respects the organic rhythms of the soul rather than the mechanical demands of the ego. The green fire that restores life is not elsewhere, not in some distant spiritual realm or future achievement, but here, now, in the depths you have been taught to fear, waiting only for your recognition, your remembrance, your conscious return to the sacred spring from which you first emerged and to which you and all things must ultimately return. The verdant sea you have always sought burns eternal in the place you stopped looking first. The living darkness at the center of your own becoming